Honor and a great pleasure to be part of this first panel. And as Christian was explaining, we can draw from Jim March's work, among others, to reflect upon and to discuss what narrative perspectives on organizational decision-making are and what they can help us to better understand. My talk is going to be a little bit different from the previous ones in the sense that I'm not going to be so much looking into the past in terms of theory development, but this is more forward-looking in terms of trying to see how we can make use of the narrative perspective on strategic decision-making. And in particular, I'm going to offer you a few ideas about how to better understand the role of narratives and storytelling in organizational strategy making. So what are we talking about? What's the phenomenon? I think we see this all around us in the sense that we can, here in Silicon Valley, we see startups pitching and they have to be successful, of course, in terms of their storytelling because they have to take off or get traction to get funding in the first place. We have this around big organizations, global companies, which are becoming increasingly skillful in their strategic storytelling and they have to be this to attract customers and investors and talent. And I think this more and more skillful, increasing strategic storytelling is also spreading to other organizations. So we're seeing this in universities, and we're seeing this all places, including kindergartens. So it's a very real phenomenon. But the problem is that I think in many ways our theories and research are lagging behind in a way that I think we're used to from this conventional perspective of thinking about organizations having a strategy, if they do have strategies, and then having a story to tell. But in actual fact, it's more complicated in the sense that if you scratch the surface, if you look at strategy making, for instance, it's obvious that actually there is no one strategy or one narrative, but there are several alternative and competing narratives oftentimes. And furthermore, when we tell the stories or when people tell the stories, they don't stay the same. They change. Actually, no story is exactly similar to the previous one. And when we tell the stories, they also trigger reactions, resistance, at times counter stories, counter narratives. And they evolve over time. So it's a mess, but I think that the mess has a name, which would be polyphony. And I think this is the interesting part. At least I'm excited about this part of strategic storytelling in organizations. And so I'm going to use my few minutes in order to test or offer you a dialogical perspective on this phenomenon. And hopefully that has also some resonance in terms of developing or inspiring us to think about how these narrative perspectives can
you get points.
Of seeing
Expect I'm taking all my time.
Okay. So apologies for the self-advertisement, but I couldn't help myself. So how to approach narratives, and I think this is one part of the problem in a way of going further with the narrative perspectives. It's because we have, if not confusion, at least there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of how to approach narratives and how to study those. And to make sense of some of this mess, we, in this book chapter and in our Academy of Management Annals paper, we elaborate on 4 alternative perspectives. The first one here is the conventional view, or the obvious view, in the sense that there are strategies, and then narratives are representations thereof. So that's the way to approach narratives. The second one is different. This would resonate with the traditions of literary analysis or study of narratives in the humanities and across social sciences, actually, in terms of looking what the narratives are, how they may differ from each other, and what are their key characteristics. There's yet a third perspective, which is a more critical angle, which would imply, looking at what the dominant representations are and what may be in terms marginalized or silenced in terms of the narratives that we hear or reproduce or at times transform. And then there's the fourth perspective. And as you can imagine, this is the one I'm really, trying to promote, in the sense that, at the end of the day, probably the most interesting thing in terms of organizations to understand strategic decision-making organizations or role of narratives in strategy making is to focus on the creation and use and perhaps the performativity of these narratives in organizations. And what I'm trying to spell out here, I'm not going to offer you a full framework or very clear-cut conclusions, but this is more, I guess, in the spirit of ScanCourse seminars, or maybe in the spirit of Jim March, offering you some ideas as to how this fourth perspective could be made alive by drawing from Bachtin's narrative analysis with a dialogical angle to that. So what would that mean? As to the core concept of strategy, seeing strategies as narratives, there's actually a lot of resonance, and it's not that difficult in a way that if we focus on the key feature of narratives or define narratives as temporal discursive constructions, then there is actually a nice linkage to understanding strategies. So that part works. Of course, what's interesting, as I was trying to point out earlier, is that oftentimes there is no one representation or one narrative, but there are alternatives and competing views which draw on different types of genres and draw from a set of discourses that are, in a given time and place, the most resonant or the most appropriate ones. Interestingly, when thinking about the future, actually these strategy narratives combine fact and fiction. But one of the difficulties here, there are two difficulties. One is this thing, and then the other part is making the argument. Yeah. One of the difficulties is that if we then draw on from this tradition of narrative analysis in literary studies or in linguistics, for instance, we're used to looking at these fully fledged narratives, as in the books that you were mentioning that Jim March or others have been drawing from. Whereas if we look at what's happening in organizations, in strategy making, is much more complex. And oftentimes the narratives we have are but fragments of narratives. So this is one of the added difficulties when doing this kind of analysis. So if strategy is narratives, then the other thing is what's then storytelling. I think that storytelling is a useful concept for us if we really try to understand, how these strategies are being developed and disseminated, reproduced, and at times transformed in and around organizations. But as said, oftentimes there are these alternatives and competing versions. So how to go about with this? I think that there's a set of ideas that at least I'm really excited about, and this would come from Bakhtinian analysis. So polyphony, to begin with, in the sense of, I think this is one of the most interesting things. From a conventional perspective, in strategy making, this is a problem, because you're supposed to think that there is one organization, one strategy, and a story to be told. Whereas, if we look at polyphony, it's precisely the other thing, the other side, which is the most interesting thing. But if you want to understand that, it's useful, that's my argument, to look at dialogicality in terms of the relationships between the narratives and the relationships of storytelling and storytellers. And then also to focus attention on the meta-narratives, which is a concept to understand this complex or the totality of a narratives in a given time and space within or in and around an organization. So how to use this perspective? I'm going to draw briefly on an empirical study. So this is an ongoing project with my colleagues. close to Helsinki in a city. And I'm going to use this. I think we're stuck. We're not stuck anymore. Now we're not. Okay, so it works. Yeah. So, very briefly, I'm going to draw and actually make only 2 points out of this ongoing empirical project that I'm proud of. So we have been following this strategy making in this city organization close to Helsinki in Finland for a period of time. And what we're really focusing on is this issue of polyphony. And we're trying to try to better understand how this polyphony is managed, or to use a term that I think is a pretty cool one, how this is orchestrated in these processes. And the first thing that what I want to, this is the first point I want to share with you guys. The first thing is that, it's not only so that, there's polyphony, but there's also a dynamic in these dialogical relationships. Sounds complicated, but basically what I'm trying to say that there's a Bakhtinian notion of heteroglossia, which basically means the dynamic in centering and decentering meaning. If we look at these processes, which we have been observing for a period of time in terms of strategy making in and around the city organization, we have this interesting dynamic, this interplay of centering and decentering, or better, opening and closing of polyphony taking place. So it's not any more complicated than this. When we started our observations, when they were beginning with their formal strategy work process, people had different kinds of views on the city's future strategy. And then the new mayor and the top management were also launching this strategy process, which involved things like strategy workshops, or creating opportunities for people via the use of web-based platforms, to provide their insights. So there was a lot of opportunity. There were arenas which allowed for polyphony to, flourish. But then at other moments, it was the opposite, in a sense, when, for example, gathering this information, then the top management team, including the mayor, they worked on the first draft of the formal strategy document. So that would be the second line there in terms of closing, synthesizing a preliminary version. And we could map out these dynamics over time, not only within a formal strategy making process, but also beyond the formal ones. Not only within one particular process, but also across several. And here we're dealing with a complex organization, which also includes different business areas and units. So those would also be having the dynamic of their own. So this is the first idea, just to launch at you guys, heteroglossia. The second one is then the question of, how are they able to orchestrate this polyphony? And I think what our analysis confirms is that, you cannot control polyphony. People will also always have different versions. They will always have counter-narratives to the formal ones, right? So this is our starting point, that there's always polyphony. But the interesting thing is that how may you be able at times, to orchestrate as to how the polyphony develops over time, which is essentially exercise of power, though limited. So we are focusing on 3 types of practices, in a sense. The first set is really about opening or creation and use of these discursive arenas and spaces. Like, the most obvious example is like a strategy workshop or a web-based platform in this. But of course, oftentimes there are many other types of arenas that may be, opened up either by the top management or then by others to allow for polyphony, right? Or then to be able to, not open, but close, meaning in terms of putting things together, which already leads to the second set of practices, which is the production of the narratives and the editing of the narratives. And we all know this. The one who gets to, write up the decisions or synthesize the findings has a lot of power. And of course, this is what's happening in our city organization as many others. So, the writing up and the editing, that's the second point, is one of the most interesting things that we find. And this is oftentimes, by the way, also multimodal, which gets me to the third point here, which is to say that then there's also a question of being able to deal with the rules of the game in a sense of how, these processes are structured, to manage the temporality in terms of how a new process may be started, which involves also the spreading of the narratives in and through these various media. But all of this is interesting because in addition to the things that we can observe, we can see or hear, it's also a question of, from a more critical angle, a question of marginalizing or silencing. So there are things that they are not talking about, or there are voices which are, not given a space or a place in this polyphony. I'll skip that. So as you can see, I'm excited about this study and this line of work. And this is work in progress. So I think that our study is kind of capturing the first parts in terms of we're looking at forms of polyphony, we're looking at different types of temporal constructions, and learning about dialogical dynamics. But there are also many other themes, and I'm just going to spell a few out at this point, and hopefully this is inspiring or interesting for others to follow suit in terms of resistance, or these very questions of inclusion or exclusion or participation in these processes. Also particularly interesting, I think, is the relationship of fact, or what we see as fact, versus fiction or the imaginary in these processes, as well as we could be studying new ideas such as open strategy, as in open innovation, if we're really stretching polyphony to the extent possible. And all of this may also be connected to post-truth storytelling. And I want to finish off actually with this slide, because this comes from Bakhtin, and it describes in a way the ultimate form of polyphony, which in his words or terms is the carnival, in a sense of really seeing this multiple voices and representations coexisting. And I want to end with this because I think this is a perspective that challenges almost the opposite to the conventional view, where the idea would be that there is one organization, one strategy, and one narrative, or the normative version of that, which would be to say that we should be striving at this, that there would be one story to tell about an organization. This is completely opposite. And what we know from, for example, our study is that, there will always be polyphony. That's the interesting thing. And you cannot control this polyphony. But yet there are means of orchestrating the polyphony. And, this is what at least makes this project so exciting for us.
But
For instance, the fact